Hello and welcome to Rapid C++ Development, combining Embarcadero C++ Builder with Microsoft Visual C++. Your instructor is Rob Swindell, Embarcadero MVP.
When you first start up RAD Studio, you may have options here to create projects or open some sample applications. I'm going to use the traditional File, then New menu option. And the top two menu options here are of most interest to us. We have Windows VCL application. VCL is the Visual Component Library. That is the framework used for visual components that make up your GUI application. You also have an option here for multi-device application. That's for targeting mobile devices, phones and tablets and the like, along with desktop operating systems like Windows and Mac OS using the same source base. So if you want to create a cross-platform project that targets multiple platforms, this would be the type of application you'd want to start. Since we're only targeting Windows here and using the traditional VCL component set, that's the option I'm going to choose. And you start off with a very basic form. There's no controls on it. You have the regular window manager features that will actually display potentially differently depending on the version of Windows and how it's configured. This is your initial application, kind of a blank slate. By default, this form is called Form 1. It depends on how many projects you've previously created. It might have a different number here, but it's just going to be form and then a number, and the name of the project is Project 1 by default. We plan on keeping this project. We'll probably want to rename some things. So we probably want to rename this project. We'll go ahead and call this the stopwatch. We're going to create a stopwatch program very similar to the one we created using Visual C++ in the previous example. Additionally, this form here is going to be our main application form. So we'll just call that main form rather than form 1. And I'm not going to make any code changes right yet. I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and compile and run this. Okay, so you see the decoration of the window manager is a little bit different based on the theme and the version of Windows that I'm running. This is Windows 10 standard theme. But it is the same application. There's no controls in it. Here's our code. So let's look at, we're going to run word count. That's this WC, traditional Unix utility on the source code, get an idea. How much code we start with? So main form uni1. Oh, I mistyped that. Okay, I see that. So we do have that precompiled header. So we only have about 125 lines of code. That's not too much. But I did notice that this is renamed. This is named incorrectly, so let's fix that. And it renames your DFM. That's kind of like your resource source file. I think it's just for Delphi form, and it did rename everything nicely for us automatically. So even though I mistyped that, fixed it, everything's good. Everything still compiles and runs. Don't have to change anything. Okay, so like I did in the MFC example, I'm going to drop an edit box in here. This is our palette of available controls that we can just drag and drop into our form. If I search for edit, there's a T-edit. And then when you run this, there's not going to be any text here. What we want is a timer that's going to periodically set a value in here. And the timer is actually part of this palette, and although it's not technically a visual component, it is part of the VCL framework, and you do get a timer available, and you drag it. And although you see an icon here for it, when the program runs, that won't be visible. When you select it, the object inspector over here shows the properties of the item that you selected. So here's our timer. It's enabled. It has an interval, default interval of 1,000 milliseconds, so once a second. and it has a default name, timer 1. We'll just change that to timer. And for now, let's say we like our interval and we like that it's enabled by default. We want when this timer ticks to do something. So we go to our events. We have an on timer event with nothing selected, nothing available. So we just double click and it creates our timer event. And similar to the MFC project, we're going to create a static timer count variable. Make it an unsigned long count. Static variables are 0 by default. And then we're going to assign the current count value to that edit box. I named it edit box. And we have a text value. And since this is C++ and we have special assignment overloads, we can assign an integer directly to that text property. We don't have to do any explicit conversions, although we could if we wanted to, but you could also just assign it like that. And then we want to increment the count. Let's run that. There we go, once a second, our counter is incrementing in this box. And we added, 3 lines of code? Okay. So if we want to go back to that form view, the designer here, you click the design button. That's also F12 to switch between code and design. So for every form or dialog, you have an associated source file. That's the CPP file, and you have a header file that defines the class and the properties that you've added. So if we look at like our header file here, we'll now see that we have an edit box and a timer. So if I decide to change the name of one of these components, best to go back to the design view and then rename it here. So if I change that, say, to timer X, and then I go back to this header file, so you can see it was changed automatically. So you don't get the converse, though. If you change it here, well, it's not going to change automatically here. But you also see that our event method automatically changed. So if I go here and I say, my timer, so not only is your property changed, or your member variable of this component, but also the event function that was created automatically when I double-clicked that visual icon here. Also, this function is renamed as well. So it's renamed in the header file, it's renamed in the source file automatically. It makes it very easy to give things meaningful names and keep those names in sync. Okay, so F12 takes you back to the form design view. And we're going to add, let's say, a checkbox. So down here in the palette, search for checkbox. There we go. And we want to call this, we want the label that's appearing, so the caption, call that enabled. And then the name of the component, that's what we programmatically access it with. We're going to call this timer enabled checkbox. And then it has a property, this checked property. So it's a Boolean, and you just read that or set it by writing to it. You don't call a function. You don't need to do any bitwise operations on it. It's just a simple property, which is very object-oriented. So back to our timer, we want to check that checkbox state. So if timer enabled checkbox checked equals true, then we'll do these two things. And the timer automatically stays enabled. You don't have to explicitly re-enable it. So now you see there's nothing going in our edit box. The timer is running because it's enabled by default, but we're not actually incrementing our counter because we have that conditional if statement. And it follows the state of the checkbox. Very nice. Now, like the MFC example, we want a couple buttons to start and stop the timer, let's say. T button, simplest form of a button. And you can also use copy and paste, so if I already have a button here I like, I can go thunk and get a second one. Easily line them up. So the first one we're going to call our start button. And the second one's going to be our stop button. And then when you click the start button, so I double click it to create the default event. There's actually multiple events available, but the one I'm interested in is this on click. So you click the button, you get this event, but you could create other event types. Anyway, so when someone clicks the start button, I want to make sure that this timer is enabled. And the current name of that timer is my timer. And enabled is the name of the property, so I'm going to set it to true. And to really give that meaning, let's make the timer default to disabled. So it's not running until you click that button. And then this button needs a better name. It's the stop button, it has it. The caption is wrong. We want that to be stop. So when you click the stop button, we just want to set the timer to disabled. Okay, so even though this checkbox is enabled, the timer's not running. So this function here, this timer handler, is never being run. This my timer is never actually being executed. But let's say we now click the start button. We still don't have the checkbox, so nothing's going on. We click it. So again, just like the MFC application, we had to do both these: have the checkbox and click the start button. Click stop, the timer stops. Start, timer's restarting. Checkbox disabled, counter's not incrementing, although the timer's still running. Now the timer's running again. So that reproduces the functionality we had in the MFC application. I'll go ahead and save all. We'll take a look back at our code using word count. And oh look, we've ballooned all the way to 189 lines of code, up from 125. So that's very little source code to create that exact same functionality. I think that's about 1/10 the amount of source code required. And that source code is digital debt. It's something that has to be maintained and checked and, you know, combed through when there's a bug and you need to find the cause of it. The more lines of code, the harder it is to find that bug often. So less code is better. We got the same functionality with 1/10 the amount of code, and honestly, a lot less time, and much easier to maintain as well. So, for example, let's say I don't like the name of this timer event here. So I can find my timer here easily, and I go to my events, and I say, I want to call this my timer tick. So the function, it just renames it, it automatically fixes it in the header file as well, and everything runs exactly as before. Now let's make this a more beautiful application. Some things we would likely want would be like a menu. So let's create a menu, a T main menu. That kind of gives you your traditional menu where you have options for file, edit, help, etc. So just creating that menu, there's not going to be any menu items in it. We could add like a timer menu, and a caption, timer. And then you want some sub-menu items, so let's say we have start and stop. So we'll want a start and a stop here. So we're duplicating the functionality of these buttons here, but I'm doing it for a good reason. I'll demonstrate shortly. So the name of this menu item is going to be start menu item, or start timer. menu item. We want a caption, start, and then similarly, stop, the name of stop timer menu item. Let's go ahead and run this, see what that looks like. So you see now we have a timer, start and stop. I can put this edit box back where it was. Now, these menu items don't actually do anything right now, so let's create that functionality. And if I just double click again, I'll get the event handler for the click. And to begin with, I'll go ahead and just copy and paste this code. This is not good design, but it's a valid example. Okay, we want the stop timer menu. So to modify this menu, we need to click on the main menu down here. And again, I probably don't want my things ending in numbers, so I'm just going to call that main menu. And the stop timer event. So again, need the checkbox enabled. I'll go ahead and enable that checkbox by default, but let's do our start. Our timer starts, stop, our timer stops. So we effectively duplicated the functionality of these two buttons. That's kind of silly. So let's remove these two. Let's remove that copy and pasted code. When we save the document, it's going to know that our events are empty and just delete those functions automatically, which is fine. That's what we wanted. So go back to our form design main menu. Now what I'm going to do here is under the event for the click, I'm going to pick that button click instead. So say start button click. And on stop, I'm going to say stop button click. So I can reuse those events from those buttons for the menu items. They're compatible. They use the same calling parameters. So that should work. I'm also going to enable this checkbox by default. Properties checked is true. So now our timer is not running, but we are enabled, so when we do start it, it'll display right away. And again, now we've reused that code from those two events. So we really didn't add any code now. There's a little bit there's some additional component instances, but no new functions were added to get that duplicated functionality. And let's say we want a bar that has buttons on it here. So we don't want to have buttons inside our main form. Instead, we want like a bar across here that has buttons and maybe labels and separators and stuff like that. That's called a toolbar. Now it did hide our edit box. Okay, I'll move the edit box first. Again, our toolbar. So now to add child components to this, you right click on it and you can add buttons and separators. So we're going to create, say, a start button and a stop button. And if you had another group of functionality, you create a separator and then add more buttons here. Then you have a little visual separation between them. Again, now this is going to be our start button. The event can point to that same event handler for starting the timer. And then this will be our stop button. Stop button. And there are two buttons here. Can't really see them. There's no glyphs associated with them. So, but they work. Stop, start. Not ideal. There's your separator, your visual line. Another button's here. So a couple of things we want to do. Probably add some pop-up bubble help here. So that's called a hint. Start timer stop timer. And we might want to rename these buttons as well. And you could provide hints for other components as well. So regular buttons can have hints here. And then your edit box can have a hint. And then we run it and we hover over these controls, it'll give us pop-up help. So you notice those hints did not appear. The container for this is this toolbar, and it has show hint set to false by default. So if we enable that, these should inherit that value. They do. So now all our buttons get the show hint automatically as well. There we go. So our hints, pop-up help is appearing. This edit box is not. It must also have a show hint property. It does, and it's defaulting to false. Now it's going to inherit that from the form. So the main form here, so I'm just changing the scope of what I'm looking at by clicking different things. I click on the form, go down to show hint. It's false. So I want everything to inherit that show hint is true. And now these buttons should also have, yeah, they do. So that's a good tip. You probably want to set your main form to show hint true to enable the hints for everything. Now, why put our buttons into a toolbar? You know, one, you get kind of the symmetric button layout with separators. Also, you can hide and show this toolbar pretty easily. So if we add a menu item, let's say, and create a view submenu, and let's add a toolbar menu item. Okay, so we want it to be a checked property. When you use this menu item, we want it to toggle the visibility of the toolbar. Now, so to do that, we're going to say toolbar visible equals, and then the name of this menu item. The default name is probably not one we want. We want to call this view toolbar menu item. And then we want it to toggle the visibility of the toolbar itself. So toolbar visible equals view toolbar menu item checked property. And since we have that auto check, it should automatically set and clear the check mark. So the toolbar is visible. We can see it with that line. We turn it off. It's appearing and disappearing. Hard to tell because we don't have any icons associated with these buttons yet. The way to associate icons with these buttons, the toolbar itself has an images property which points to an image list, and we don't have any image lists here. We could create an image list by dragging one from the palette. It's not populated with any images by default, so you'd have to double-click this and add some compatible files. If you want to start off with a set of images pre-populated in an image list, one trick I'd like to show you. Let's go ahead and save our project. We're going to open a different one. We're going to open a template, SDI template, real quick. And you'll see here there's an image list already. And if we double click it, it's pre-populated with a bunch of icons. Now these are older 16 by 16 icons. Probably not the best, but if you want to go ahead and start with those set of icons, you can copy this, reopen your project, and then just paste it in there. So now I already had an image list, so this one was called image list 2. Let's rename that. There we go. So you can see we copied all the images as well, the image and the image lists. And now if we want to associate a specific image. So starting with image 0. So that's fine. This one we probably want a different image, but the whole toolbar needs to be associated. So find that images property, select the image list because it's the only compatible component that's now visible, and now we have some icons pre-populated. Now these aren't really appropriate, so maybe we want to pick a different icon based on the use case. We can go ahead and look through our images quickly, see if there's something really relevant. Doesn't really look like it. We could always add more icons and select those, but we'll start with these. So now we have some icons. So not the icons we like, but that's an example of how to use a toolbar. Something that would save us some code and time would be to use an action list. One reason why you might want to do that is, so although we're sharing the same event handler between these buttons, these toolbar buttons, and these menu items, they all use the same event handler here to start and stop the timer. They can share other things as well. So let's say we wanted to share the same captions and hint, the bubble help that pops up, or the icon that has appeared. The way to do that is using an action list. Because right now, if I go and I edit this menu item, like start timer, I can associate this with an image. If I first associate the menu with an image list. So you see, it has the main menu itself has an images property, and I could associate it with that same image list and pick those same images manually. But I'm kind of duplicating effort. I'd have to then say, go pick the right image, and if I decide to change one, the other one's not going to change. So, if I have 2 or 3 items that have, say, an icon or a hint, I want them to all stay in sync. The way to do that is with an action list. So let's put an action list in here. And, if you know this ahead of time, it's best to start with your action list and not do what I did. But I wanted to demonstrate kind of the long way, and then we'll get into the short way. So our action list is going to have 2 actions. We're going to have a start timer action, and the caption can just be start. I think by context that'll probably be fine. And then we're going to have a stop timer action. And then when it executes, we actually want to do the start button click and the stop button click, because it's the same function signature. We don't have to rewrite that code. And now these buttons let's say these buttons here, we want to delete our click event. We don't need that anymore. And we want to associate it with the action. So go here, go to the action, start timer action. And then the stuff. So notice how the name changed automatically, the caption. Inherited it from the action list. So stop timer action. Now we also want to inherit some button or some graphics potentially, but I'll demonstrate that. First I'm going to do the menu items. So back to the menu, start, so we don't need that any longer. Associate it with the start timer action. Stop needs to be associated with the stop timer action. There. And now I can clear like our hints and stuff too. If we had hints, we don't here. Okay. Do these guys have hints? No. Okay. So here's another. Okay, so this button does have a hint. Let's go ahead and clear that. And clear that one. And we'll clear our images. So -1 means no image. So I'm kind of going back to default values here. We can leave that one the way it was. Again, from the events, I want to select now the action list that I created, the actions from the action list, and clear the on-click event, clear the on-click event, set the action list. So the normal first step would be to create the action list and then create your controls. Okay. So they're working. Again, we don't have any icons. I cleared those images. But the way I want to do the images now is not manually setting the properties here, but instead setting them for the actions and inheriting those values. So the action list itself needs to be associated with our image list. There we go. And then the actions, each action needs its own special icon value or image index. So we'll go ahead and say, you know, that starts the timer and the X stops the timer. So we see we have our buttons and they work still, and we got the icons that we picked. We're not getting any hints. So let's set our hints. Stop timer. Okay, there we go. So we inherited those from the action, and we're inheriting these from the actions. Now we don't have any images showing up here, so let's look into that. So the main menu needs to be associated with the image list. There we go. So now our menu items as well inherit the icons that we chose. And if I change them, they'll change for both the button and the menu item. Or if I change the caption, same for these. So let's say I decide, oh, I don't like start. I want to make that say go. Now, the regular button changed to go. The menu option changed to go. This doesn't have any text, so it stays unchanged. But you see how we're automatically inheriting all these properties in a very object-oriented fashion between three different controls. And we really did not add a whole lot of code. If we save this, and we go back, look how much code. Oh, we added about 50 lines of code, maybe 60 lines of code. Not much. And we certainly didn't need to type very much. And now we can manage our actions or our common behaviors from the action list, and all our controls can just automatically inherit that behavior. The next thing I want to demonstrate is how to use more modern icons in your toolbars and your buttons. These are kind of small, there are not a lot of colors, so the first thing we want to do is change the size of our toolbar here to accommodate larger buttons and larger or buttons with larger icons. So let's go ahead and let's try that to 32 by 32. And we're going to get rid of this classic image list that we copy and pasted from another sample project. And I just deleted that. I just hit the delete key. Everything still runs. Everything's still fine. It automatically goes and updates all the associations. So we just don't have any images now. Now we want to add the more modern image list. You start with a image collection. And we want to populate that with some icons. And I have a set of icons downloaded from Icons 8. We'll go with the color selection. And, we can go and pick some that look appropriate. So let's say like that's good for stopping, and I'm using Control-Click to multi-select. Oh, look, there's a clock. There's kind of a clock-looking thing. A check mark. A big X. These kinds of things. So we add those to our image collection. Hit OK. Now we can't directly use our image collection because it can have multiple representations of the same icons that mean the same thing, but for different resolutions or pixel density. So the next step is to create a virtual image list. And we need to associate that with this image collection. So by setting the image collection property to point to the same image collection we already created, double click it. Now we need to add everything from that image collection. So we can just do select all. And now all the image collections are also represented by multiple image sizes inside this virtual image list. And now we can associate, say, like our actions with our new virtual image list, and this toolbar, images, and our main menu. And then when we run it, we get more modern looking icons that start and stop and do the things that we want. So one little problem I noticed is that the check mark for our menu item, so even though our toolbar is visible by default, the check mark for this menu item was not checked by default. So I'll go ahead and enable that by default. So when we run it, it kind of makes more logical sense. The toolbar is visible, toolbar is not visible. So the check mark follows the visibility right off the bat. So that's a little bug fix. So our final code size, 255 lines of code. Let's compare the resulting programs that we created with Visual C++ and C++ Builder. So to begin with, we have our MFC stopwatch program. It's about 216 kilobytes. It's functional, but very simple. No tooltip, no bubble help. Yeah, I'm sure those things can be added, but certainly was not readily available. Okay. And then the CBuilder application. Very similar, same functionality, but we have a menu and we have tooltips, and we have shared resources. So very similar, but compare this code size. So you can have this program with 1,245 lines of code, most of it auto-generated by Visual C++. Or you can have this program with 255 lines of code.